birthday. And if you don't know, it's our 5th birthday. So thanks for coming along to this special occasion. Because it's our 5th birthday, you don't have to bear with me prattling on. We've got extra guests to do introductions tonight, which means you all win. And for those of you who come to a lot of Cabot events, you know what I mean. So I'm going to pass you over to Nishan, our PVC of Research and longtime friend of the Cabot Institute, who's going to say a few words about us.
All right.
Absolutely. Well, that microphone actually works. So.
That one didn't work.
So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As Rich said, my name is, it's all right. That was quite nice. My name is Nishan Kanagaraj. I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for Research. So one of my responsibility is to support the research activities in the university. And Cabot is one of 3 university research institutes we have. And the university research institutes are meant to support cross-disciplinary working, engage with the external partners, and also create new opportunities for the university. So I was going to talk about the 5th birthday. Now that Rich has mentioned it, I'll keep it very short. So it was an experiment from this university. So 5 years ago, we started the University Research Institute, and we thought this is a new way of promoting interdisciplinary working in the university. And 5 years now, I'm looking back, what a tremendous success it has been. Nobody would have predicted that we would have achieved so much in the 5 years that Cabot has managed to achieve. And as Rich mentioned, this is the 5th annual lecture, and this has been a very prestigious event. We had some fantastic speakers in the past, and this year is no exception. So we are delighted George is here to give us a speech, and Paddy Ireland, my colleague, will introduce him later. But before I pass on to Paddy, I just want to take a few minutes to talk about Cabot and what they have achieved. And in the last 5 years, they have engaged with about 30,000 people in various events. Through public events and various events that they've organized, they've been able to take some of the activities that are happening in this university to share with the wider public. And for a university, that is an important mission. We're not here just to do research and publish papers. We are here to educate the next generation of graduates, but also to make sure that what we do has relevance and we share the findings with the external community. And in that sense, I'm very proud that Cabot has managed to do that so well in the last few years. Partly because the topic is very important and we all care about it. And I'm sure you saw in the news today about Storm Abigail and all the things that happen. It's constantly in the news and we care a lot about it, but sometimes we don't know how to deal with some of these issues. And Cabot's mission is to understand how we deal with some of the climate change and some of the environmental challenges that we all face in the future. I have some highlights that I want to share with you that Cabot has managed to achieve in the last 5 years. So some of you might have heard about the Icelandic volcanic ash. I'm going to try and pronounce it. Eyjafjallajökull. Now, none of you know whether I got it right or wrong. So it is something that our colleagues have been very instrumental in helping the government to understand how to deal with the aftermath of that ash, and our Cabot researchers were instrumental in that. We have also been involved in various small islands to help share some of the learning to deal with climate change. And I'm really pleased our Cabot has engaged with the city in great deal. So in fact, Rich, I think, is going to be in Paris soon with the mayor to present some of the work that has been done in this university regarding COP21. So that is, again, a great testament to the engagement that we have with the city. So I don't want to go on and on. We have done a lot in the last 5 years, but these things don't happen by chance. There's a lot of people involved in making this a successful activity. And it is about leadership as well. And I just want to acknowledge the great work that Paul Bates, who is the first director of Cabot, and now Rich Pancoast have managed to do in leading this activity. And it's fantastic that we have this success to celebrate today. So I just want you to all join me in congratulating Rich, Paul, and the team for all that they have achieved in the last 5 years. So I just want to finish off by saying we're not complacent. We think there's a lot more that needs to be done. Cabot is here to stay, and we will hope to see you in future events as well. And we would like to see you engage with Cabot and the wider activities that we undertake as Cabot Institute, this university. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. Now I would like to invite Paddy to say a few words about the speaker.
Thanks, Nishan. My name's Paddy Ireland, and from Monday I will be the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the annual Cabot Institute lecture, the 5th one, and an even greater pleasure to introduce you to George Marshall from Climate Outreach. In fact, George is returning to Bristol because George is an alumnus of the university, graduating in sociology in, I'm told, 1985. And over the last 25 years, George has clearly worked tirelessly at various levels in the environmental movement. For many years, he worked as a senior campaigner for Greenpeace in the US. He's worked for the Rainforest Foundation. And as we're going to see tonight, he's really settled on the issue as to why, when we know that climate change is taking place, when all the science tells us that, and when all the science tells us that it is a genuinely serious issue, why do most of us still fail to recognize the scale of the threat that we face? And in the run-up to the United Nations Climate Change Convention in Paris, why is it after many, many years of negotiations, why is it that political action appears to be so lamentably slow and ineffective? Now, George is the co-founder of the Oxford-based charity Climate Outreach, and he's one of the leading European experts on climate change communications. And I think he's worked with academics, with governments, and with campaign organizations around the world. And he's particularly interested in looking at developing new narratives for non-green audiences that aren't convinced about climate change, like skeptical conservatives and people of religious faith, seeking solutions to the complex cultural and psychological obstacles that apparently make it hard for us to accept and engage with this crucial issue. Now, at the end of the talk, he'll be taking questions, and then he will be signing copies of his book, Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. He'll be signing copies of that book outside. So please welcome George and his presentation on how we conspire to ignore climate change and how we can work together to create faster action to deal with it. George.
Thank you very much. Am I good? I'm wired up. That's good. So, weekend before last, I was sitting in the park with two friends. One of them happened to be a climate scientist. The other was a columnist on a newspaper. And it was a lovely, lovely day. Do you remember weekend before last? And we're sitting there, and people in the park are doing all of the things that the pictures in the newspapers the next day showed them doing there. Kids were playing, bouncing balls, people licking ice cream. And of course, we are completely miserable. We're sitting there on this gorgeous day, grumbling. Not surprisingly, and actually also saying to ourselves, what miserable gits we are that we cannot enjoy this lovely afternoon. The reason being, of course, that we've been infected by the climate change bug. We were seeing the world, and we were seeing that day through the lens of what we knew about climate change. We knew in our bones, and of course it was confirmed the next day, that it was the hottest November day ever recorded. Which was why it was hard for us to join in the fun that was all about us. There's something kind of unnerving about weather like this that feels familiar, but you actually know is somehow not genuine. Freud had a sense of how things that were not quite what they seemed to be could be deeply disturbing. He called it unheimlich, unhomely. Though the word that's usually translated that is uncanny. And this was an uncanny day. Climate change is now well underway and accelerating. October was the 367th consecutive month with global temperatures above the 20th century average. I'll say that again. 367 months in a row, the climate has been above the average. In fact, that average hardly means anything now. And you know, on weather forecasts, they say unseasonal weather, or they say temperatures above normal. We're moving into this uncanny world where the normal is no longer normal. There is no normal. We're beyond normal. Now, I could talk a great deal at length about where this is taking us. And when I did my first draft of this talk, I waxed lyrical about the worst possible predictions of business as usual climate impacts. The collapse of agricultural production in the main grain areas, the death of oceans, the submersion of most of the world's great cities, millions of people on the move, the annihilation of sub-Saharan Africa. And we can go on, there's plenty out there, as you know. And already I suspect, even as I start to mention these things as bullet points, your attention may very well be drifting away. Maybe I haven't been talking quite long enough for it to drift away. But whenever we talk about these impacts, it is hard to maintain focus. We would prefer not to care. Well, it's not that we don't care, but we would prefer not to have to care. I guess that's the key point. We want to make that choice between what we pay attention to and what to ignore. And like many people who work on this issue professionally, I keep myself sane by never looking too deeply at the issue I work on. Those of us who work on this can already in ourselves see some of the models for why other people do not accept it. I find I take on just as much information as I require and no more. And I guess climate change for many of us who work on this issue professionally is like a huge collective secret where we all memorize one line, but we make sure that we don't put it all together. And my friends who work professionally as scientists, and this is very interesting, say that actually, for many of them, there is a taboo about actually talking about the issue as a whole in casual conversation. It's that thing of putting the whole story together. You work on one small part rather than the whole. What's more, I think, because we're all deeply implicated in climate change, listening to the science and accepting that problem means accepting the poisoned apple of knowledge that all of our actions, however well-intentioned, however pleasurable, could be directly linked to that wider crime. So is it surprising when people look at it, but they go, you know what, I don't think I really need to know about that. You know, is it any surprise that people want to play ball? They want to eat ice cream rather than join us on our grumpy bench. In that film When Harry Met Sally, there's that great scene where the lady at the table, she overhears Meg Ryan having her false orgasm as she's eating her Reuben sandwich, and she says, "I'll have what she's having." And was it any surprise that people would overhear our conversation and say, you know what, I don't think I'm going to have what they're having. I'm going to keep well away from that. And that is an active choice. That's one of the reasons why people don't accept it. And maybe it's actually the thought about having a Reuben salad in Katz's Deli, which incidentally was on the other side of the street from the tenement building where I used to live in New York City, that reminds me of the story of Jan Karski. Now, Jan Karski was a Polish resistance fighter, and he'd witnessed the murder of Polish Jews in Belzec concentration camp. Very unusual, but he'd seen this, he managed to escape, and he had gone to America to try and persuade people of the extent of Nazi genocide that was under full steam at that point in 1942. To his dismay, few people believed him. He went and spoke to Felix Frankfurter. Felix Frankfurter was a Supreme Court judge and one of the smartest, brightest legal minds of his generation. And Felix Frankfurter could not accept what he was saying. But this was eyewitness testimony. Why could he not accept it? Frankfurter said, "I don't say that the young man is lying. I said I'm unable to believe him, and that is different." Despite the vast differences between the Holocaust and climate change, it does have this much in common, that they are both almost beyond imagination. And as I'll explain, if anything kills us, it will not be a lack of rationality, it could be a lack of imagination. And so maybe like Justice Frankfurter, we find that we can hold that state of knowledge without the state of belief. We can keep these two things separate. So last week there was a US poll. These are very regular occurrences, these polls. People in America, they like their polls. A poll came out in which 2/3 of people said that climate change is happening. There is a very broad-based support that there is something serious going on, but scarcely 10% of people expressed any great concern about it. Now, in Britain, things are maybe not quite so polarized. In Britain, the vast bulk of people, that's 70% of people, consistently in opinion polls, are somewhat concerned. Which actually I think you can read as, well, as you happen to mention it, when I think about it, well, yes, I suppose that is a bit concerning, yes. So what was the question again? Because one of the strange things, I do a lot of focus group work, and one of the strange things is if you don't specifically ask people about climate change, strangely, no one seems to mention it. In dozens of focus groups and polls across Britain on the lead up to the last election, no one mentioned climate change as a major issue that they wished to have addressed by an incoming government. I read the polls, I read the surveys. Climate change was not on there. And even when people were prompted, they were given a list of issues that they wanted a future government to deal with, climate change never came off the bottom of the heap. So is it any surprising that then when we went into the election campaign, with the exception of Natalie Bennett, who of course, I mean, she's Green Party, so she is going to mention it, but with the exception of her, it did not appear in the debates, it did not even appear as a question in the debates. It is therefore, because of a public lack of engagement, it is removed from the political discourse. We know politicians have their own agendas, but nonetheless, the agenda is ultimately led by what people mention. And let's face it, the last election was the most focus group-led election in my experience. Now, we have lots of terms for mass concern. We can talk about mania or panic or terror or hysteria, but we don't seem to have any term for mass indifference in the face of an overwhelming threat. I mean, what do we call it? Rampant mass wisteria? I don't know. Cerebral dilettantia? Chronic distractivitis? I don't know. Please, suggest a name. And I think we live under some massive conjuring trick, some huge sleight of hand, where we're also busy tapping into our little electronic toys, but we don't notice the trapdoor opening up underneath our feet. Now, the truth is humans are very good at ignoring things. It's a key part of our intelligence. Recent cognitive psychology has become far more interested in how it is that we come to ignore things than how it is that we come to pay attention to them. Because we live in an information-saturated society, and it is our capacity to ignore things which keeps us sane. See, for example, I'm able to look and scan across your faces now without my cortex exploding from the sheer amount of information contained in looking at you all, which would certainly make for a lively talk. But nonetheless, I can look across and I can see a friend. I can see someone I know, I can recognize someone. And the reason that I can do that is because I can disregard and detach all of the information of every other face that I'm looking at. I mean, nothing personal, but we do it all the time, don't we? So we have this capacity to ignore things. We also seek to avoid anxiety and stress. We do everything we can to ignore the things which might cause it. But of course that's not enough, because if what we did was we just ignored things which cause us anxiety, then life would be blissful but short. Because we depend on our ability to pick out certain things. We depend for our survival on safety mechanisms that alert us to issues that we really do have to pay attention to, but cut through those natural biases and demand our attention. And here's one of the problems with climate change, because it is singularly poorly constructed for engaging those innate mechanisms. We respond most strongly to threats that are here, that are now, that are visible, that have a clear cause, that can be dealt with readily through simple actions, things that threaten violent and personal impacts, and especially things that come from a familiar enemy, because as social animals we are acutely geared to paying attention to things from enemies. To these we might add additional cultural components that demand our attention. Things that cause disgust, for example, things that break social convention, things that threaten social disapproval. We constantly have these signals, these antennae which are looking out for these social signals. Eating puppies, for example. For years I've been trying to point out that one of the impacts of climate change might be we're forced to eat puppies. It's not a message which has gone down very well. But if we could argue that, there is no question we would demand and attract people's attention. Actually, I haven't really noticed a joke. Climate change scores very poorly on every single one of these points, which is why our newspapers are full of stories of the things that do score highly on those points, like Ebola, which, as far as I'm aware, has not killed a single person in Britain. Islamic State, which executes people on YouTube. These things are very visible, clear, intent, with enemies driving them. Or indeed, if we're talking about social disapproval, whether or not Jeremy Corbyn kneels or doesn't kneel, or how deeply he bows on Remembrance Sunday, and so on. So our cognition is dictated by biases, ingrained systems that direct our attention towards these triggers, or what we could call these salient triggers, these things which demand our attention. Professor Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize for his pioneering work in the identification of cognitive biases. I don't know if you've read, I strongly recommend his book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. Professor Kahneman told me that in his view, climate change contains a toxic combination of these biases. Not only is it uncertain, it is in the future, and it requires substantial costs, all areas that his research tells him that we're very poorly set up to cope with or to pay attention to. But it has the worst possible combination of these three. It requires certain current costs to avoid larger but yet uncertain costs at some time in the future. He was a very nice man, and he just said, "I'm so sorry." Okay. There's no skin off my nose, Professor Kahneman. He said, "I'm so sorry." He says, "I can see no hope on this issue." So he's welcome on our bench. We can sit there and look at people licking their ice cream together. But we have to remember that that's maybe what cognitive psychology experiments tell us. And we need to recall that the vast majority of these experiments are conducted and depend for their research data on undergraduates, and it's a group from which one can't necessarily infer universal truths. Considering that I chain smoked my way through my years here at Bristol, and that was when I wasn't in an alcohol-induced coma, I don't really think that I would trust anything that I might have said at that time about future costs. Nor actually, I mean, to take the point even further in terms of future costs, my friends who would subsidize their drinking by visits to the sperm donor clinic, which surely would cause a complete nightmare to any eugenicist. So we also know that not only can we entirely trust what comes through the limited context of an experiment, but we know there's only one part of a story. We know this from our own experience, don't we? I mean, we invest billions in defense and insurance in anticipation of uncertain future threats. Humans have an extraordinary capacity for altruism, for long-term thinking. We can tolerate any cost, including the risk to our own lives, if necessary, if this is in the context of something which is sufficiently endorsed and condoned and rewarded by wider society. I'll repeat that. If it is sufficiently endorsed and condoned and rewarded by wider society, because surely this is the critical point when it comes to climate change, that our attitudes to climate change and climate risk are mediated through the lens of the cultural values and indeed the stories that we tell around them. Clearly, there's nothing impossible about this issue at all. The fact that many people are deeply concerned, active, engaged, as I imagine that many of you are, is surely proof that there's nothing inherently impossible about this issue. But that is not to say that I'd say this for myself, I'm sure this might go for many of you, find it easy to engage with an issue of this kind. It is nonetheless hard for us to deal with things which have this formulation. And therefore, even those of us who fully accept climate change or what the science is telling us still need to translate it into narratives that make it comprehensible or imaginable, or immediate, or certain, or affordable, or all of these things which might otherwise block us. As you heard, I worked for many years as a campaigner for campaign organizations. That's what campaign organizations do. That is why there's a tension between campaign organizations, for example, and scientists. The role of an organization like Greenpeace is to take the science and to make it immediate, to make it of concern, and that means obstructing those biases and making it here and now and possible and affordable and maybe to some degree threatening. But what is maybe curious about climate change is that most people show a remarkable capacity to do the exact opposite. Having decided not to take action, they can then construct climate change in a shape that deliberately creates distance and puts it as far away as they can in time and space. In other words, knowing that we have obstacles in certain ways, they then construct it around those obstacles. So it's a remarkably consistent quality of attitude studies that people's concern is directly proportional to distance about climate change. So when asked whether climate change will affect them, the vast majority of people say no. But they seem strangely more willing to think that it will affect their family. There might be some wishful thinking here. And yet more willing to think that it might affect their community, as if somehow, strangely, it won't affect them because there's some bubble over them in their house, but it will affect the people around them. And more likely to think that it will affect their country. And when it comes to other countries or other species, and then ultimately people in the future, the risk of climate change becomes far greater still. So you find this strange situation in British opinion polls that more people will answer yes to the question, is climate change a major threat for future generations, than will answer yes to the question, is climate change a major threat? Do you see what I mean? So there are some people who will not answer that climate change is a major threat unless it is presented in the form, is climate change a major threat to future generations? And this is found consistently in the research from all countries. So we are constructing narratives to crash headfirst into the very obstacles which make it hard for us to accept. And then when you ask people in focus groups, why do you think it's so hard for us to accept climate change, they say, oh, well, because it's very far away and it's very distant. And people know how these cognitive biases work. So I have to say, what a stroke of genius when you are struggling to communicate to people a message that extreme overheating, let's call it that, is going to affect them, their family, and their daily life, to brand it with a bear that lives in the frozen Arctic, 1,000 miles away, sitting on an iceberg, chewing on seals. Right? Or I have to add, somewhat cynically, a bear that lives in thousands of gift shops, because the sad truth is that in the world of global conservation organizations, one is never too far from the mail order catalog. Incidentally, how many people in this room, hands up, who has seen a polar bear in its natural environment? Wow, okay. Hands up, how many people here have seen an environmental campaigner dressed in a polar bear outfit in his natural environment? Okay, QED. I have huge pride to be part of an environmental movement that has done so much to make this issue strong, to keep it alive, to maintain political momentum through some very, very quiet and dull periods. But I think we need to recognize that we have gone too far with claiming this issue as our own. Because really, this is not an environmental issue at all, even though it might in some ways superficially resemble one, because it appears to be concerned with pollution and consumption. It could equally well be considered, and indeed should be considered, in my view, as an economic issue, an international policy issue, a military defense issue, an immigration issue, a community issue, a faith issue, a parenthood issue, a social justice issue. It could be seen from any of those points of view. When environmental organizations adopted this, they sought an iconic natural symbol that speaks to their values, indeed, my values. If it had been a human rights organization which had got there first, or trades unions, or development organizations, or health organizations, or women's rights organizations, and if they had got there first, there wouldn't be a bear in sight, let's face it. And then this is compounded by lazy editors always looking for a stock image that they can slap into their newspaper article, or a bit of B-roll footage that they can put over their voiceover and so on. So here, once again, there's this sense of a public conspiracy, or conspiracy is too strong a word, but shall we say cultural cooperation, working together to ensure that this issue is as far as possible on the periphery of our daily concerns. Everybody wants it to be environmental, because that is as far away as you can put it. Of course, environmentalists are very happy for it to be environmental, because we want it to be our issue, even though, by truth, it probably shouldn't be. Media keep it environmental as an environmental issue which is covered by environmental correspondence, relegated to some wildlife documentary department. Business makes it part of their social responsibility. Branding, along with, I don't know, litter and work safety. Politicians are very happy to keep it as environmental, as a footnote for some marketeer, design audience, segment audience, detoxifying their brand, as we heard from the Conservatives. Because the economy is the big issue of our time, or migrants, or social rights, or whatever the issues are. We've heard very, very little of it in the last 5 years. David Cameron has still, in 5 years, not made a single speech to the British public or his own party about the greatest threat in human history. I don't mind calling it that. So, for a long time, it was assumed by scientists that the greatest reason for this lack of acceptance was a lack of knowledge about climate change. Many of them are still indeed very committed to this argument, this idea that we're somehow, it's called information deficit model, but we're somehow empty vessels who need to be filled up with information so that we can make intelligent and rational decisions. And maybe all that we need really to try and capture people's own imagination is better information. Or maybe, if you're a cool scientist, what we need is infographics or animated 3D whizzing blobby things. Indeed, you can see them all over the internet. Indeed, I think maybe the best proof that research evidence does not shift attitudes is that for 20 years, psychologists and sociologists have been preparing and developing and presenting their evidence that information does not change attitudes to scientists, climate scientists who still persistently disregard it. Because there is a science to human attitudes as well, which tells us, but this is not actually how humans work at all. Indeed, now with neural imaging, it confirms the teaching of philosophers over the millennia, that our brains contain distinctly different decision-making processes that operate in parallel. One we know is analytic, contemplative, taking its time dealing with numbers, logic, data. And this is the language of science. It is a trusted advisor, but it does not hold the reins of power. Those are held by the other system, which is faster, intuitive, emotional, and dominant. And this leads our decisions. I should say that this other emotional, psychologists call it affective reasoning process, has exceptional skill in marketing the rational arguments and data to support the conclusions it's already decided to reach. That's another bias. We could call that assimilation bias, and we do this all the time, compulsively, finding the evidence to support the conclusions we already have, that our kids are smarter and funnier than anybody else's, which in my case, of course, happens to be true. Our choice of restaurant really was the right one. There's indeed that we were right all along. In fact, every domestic argument, I have to say, especially including those smart and funny children who are by nature natural barristers, is a case study in assimilation bias of people marshalling and pulling together the arguments which best serve the interests of a point that they have already decided to make. And that is why people who do not accept climate science are not foolish or ignorant, nor are they uneducated. In fact, if anything, they're rather better educated than the majority of people, which enables them then to cherry-pick the arguments that support their own contrary point of view. But they're also, and this is very indicative, of a single distinct demographic. They are middle-aged and older, white, affluent men with conservative politics. And that conservative politics is particularly relevant It is, in some surveys, we found that it is that people's politics is a better predictor of their position on climate change, and that climate change is a better predictor of people's politics than any other single factors. In America, people's attitudes on climate change is a better predictor of how people vote in an election than their position on birth control or capital punishment or gun control. That tells us that this has become completely infected with social and cultural meaning. Clever people do clever bias. They mobilize their intelligence and education of building complex narratives of self-justification. Indeed, just I've interviewed many people in oil companies who do the same, taking genuine, no question, they are decent people and they are taking genuine pride in their engineering prowess, which, in a narrative that they tell themselves, provides the bedrock of a world economy. And indeed, all parties are involved in selective confirmation bias, shaping climate change in their own issue, whether it is around polar bears or social justice or business opportunities or secret plots for world domination or the Day of Judgment or whatever it is that happens to fit your worldview. And this is an important point about climate change, which makes it unusual amongst the threats that we face. That, to borrow a word from linguistic studies, it is a multivalent issue. It lends itself all too ready to multiple interpretations. Horst Rittel, the policy planning specialist in University of Berkeley, California, called it a wicked problem. One of the qualities of a wicked problem is that wicked problems become different according to the questions that you ask of them. They shape themselves around the values and the questions that you ask of them. And indeed, this is what happens with climate change. We could call it a jelly mold issue. It pours into and fills the mold that you prepare for it. Mass delusions are a regular feature of human society and history. We form our views, we judge threats on the basis of the social cues that we receive from the people around us. And this received wisdom becomes ever stronger with repetition. That, after all, is the nature of public rumor. So just as climate change itself contains powerful feedbacks, there are feedbacks also in the attitudes that we form about it. There are feedback mechanisms in which falsehood can gain currency through repetition and distribution. With an abstract and distant threat, like climate change, a public attitude of denial or indifference is extremely and highly contagious. That is why when people are asked to report on the views of others on climate change, they consistently and alarmingly underestimate the actual level of concern and overestimate the level of denial of their fellow citizens. Climate change struggles to form a coherent and compelling, socially constructed narrative because of the absence of an enemy. And this is another thing which makes it unusual amongst the problems we face. As I said, our most acute and alert threat detector, that affective side of our thinking processes, is related to attacks from fellow humans. Climate change is uniquely problematic in this regards because it's a collective problem to which we all, I'm talking about us in the room, I realize that there are people in the world who are not responsible, but we all in various ways contribute to it, and from which in various unpredictable ways we are going to be impacted or we're going to suffer. Human ethics is based around intention. In experiments, children as young as 3 can clearly differentiate between something which is a cause of an intention to cause harm to another child or something which is an accident. As young as 3. So if there is wiring, we are clearly wired on that. But there's no intention with climate change. Even the worst people in this debate have no intention to cause harm. And so here we have a problem. We actually have a weak and unbalanced narrative. We have a challenge that requires a level of mobilization that has not been seen since the war, but we don't have any Nazis. Or rather, we don't have any Nazis unless we choose to put some in. Godwin's law, I like these kind of laws, Godwin's law states that in any online debate, if it goes on long enough, it will inevitably start to talk about Nazis. And this is especially true of a discussion about climate change, because in the absence of intentional enemies, this is an unbalanced and hollow narrative that starts to suck them in. So if you come to believe that climate change is a constructed myth, as all too many conservatives do, then you're drinking deep of the Kool-Aid of conspiracy theory, with a natural crossover to the belief that moon landings were faked and the Twin Towers was faked and so on. And no one knows this better than your fellow Bristol professor, Stefan Lewandowski, who may very well be here tonight. Steve found that the online comments to the first paper that he wrote, discussing the link between climate change denial and conspiracy theory, but the online comments were so bitter and vituperative, and no doubt so full of Nazis, that they generated enough material for his second paper. I think that's the academic equivalent of a fast breeder reactor. You could probably keep going and going and going on this. And looking forward, I should say that this is one of the greatest dangers of climate change, because as the impacts ratchet up, as I'm afraid they will, certainly will, there's no getting away from that, whatever the outcome, there will be an almighty head of steam of resentment, anger, and grief looking for a target. And history, and indeed we don't have to look far in the whole crazy world around us, shows how dangerous it can be when anxious and stressed people start looking for somebody to blame. An issue like climate change, which lacks any distinctive and reliable enemy, will, I predict, find some. And this is a warning for us. Last week we celebrated our annual Pyromania on the 5th of November. Record-breaking fires were also breaking out around the world. In Indonesia, they were burning up as much carbon dioxide as the entire US economy produces. The land is in drought from El Nino, and the fires were started, ironically, or I have to say, pathetically and distressingly, in large part for clearance for oil palm plantations to meet, in part, the demand created by the European biofuels directives. Also on the 5th, I had a little look at the news. I noticed that there was a fire in the Amazon that was blazing, having already burned down 730 square miles of rainforest, including the territory of the Awa. The Awa are one of the last formerly uncontacted tribes on Earth who, it would seem with very good reason, do everything they can to avoid making contact with us. The US, incidentally, that same week reported that 2015 is set to be a record year for forest fires. And on that very same day, the 5th of November, an academic paper said that all of Puerto Rico's forests are due to burn down this century. Well, there we are, that's on the 5th of November. Well, no surprise at all that Radio 4's flagship news program today mentioned none of that. In fact, what they decided to do instead was to run a large chunk of the program puffing a new book on how to make intelligent dinner party conversation. And having posh people sitting around in a radio studio, snickering at lower class dinner party conversations. I'm so glad to see the inexorable progress of social equality in Britain. And on the theme of dinner party conversations, my friend Mayor Hillman, who wrote a very good book, How to Save the Planet, one of the first people to talk about making personal change on climate change, he decided to make some intelligent dinner party conversation. He was invited to a dinner party with some fellow professionals. He's a retired professional. And the conversation at the dinner party turned to people's flights, where people were going for their holidays. These were well-off retired professionals, and they were going on holiday. Somebody was flying over to Australia to visit their families. People were traveling around. They were having a wonderful time, because this is actually a great time to have, to be on a pension and have time. And Mayor couldn't stand it any longer. As somebody who was passionate about climate change, who completely gets it, he like sat there and he fumed and he fumed and he fumed, and then he completely blew up. And anyone who knows Mayor will know what that looks like. And he blew up and he said, "How can you say this? How can you say this? Have you got any idea about the impacts that the climate change of your flights is going to have on you, the children that you've been visiting in Australia?" Anyway, there was a total silence fell over the dinner party. And then somebody said, "My word, what a lovely spinach tart." Oh, indeed, what a delicious spinach tart. And they talked for it, according to Mayor, for the next 10 minutes about a spinach tart. What a lovely spinach tart. Oh, is it organic? How lovely. Did you grow it? Oh, you must give me the recipe. Mayor had charged headfirst into the socially described boundaries of silence around climate change, an awkwardness that defines what can and cannot be talked about. Because although I've been talking so far about how we talk about it, the reality is that the strongest narrative around climate change is the non-narrative of collective silence. This, again, is in the nature of a social conspiracy. It's not open, it's not deliberate, it's a secret contract established through subtle codes. And it's uncannily similar to the silence that, that's uncanny again, that crosses societies around human rights abuse. Not usually during the abuses, because after all, when human rights abuse is going on, there's usually a very good reason for keeping quiet, but after the abuses happen, for a generation when certain topics become out of bounds. The late Stanley Cohen, sociologist at the University of London who studied specifically this area of publicly constructed denial around human rights abuse, it put it this way. I quote, "Without being told what to think about or what not to think about, and without being punished for knowing the wrong things, societies arrive at unwritten agreements about what can be publicly remembered and acknowledged." And so it is in climate change. Here we are, we're floating in our isolation tanks, coping with what we know, or maybe actively suppressing it, not talking to each other, having socially constructed boundaries of silence around areas which make it impossible to talk about it, knowing what we know, but not having the chance to share our anxiety, our despair, or indeed our hope. Maybe something more that leads to this. Because the configuration of climate change is a steady deterioration leading to the destruction of the whole world, indeed, as we know it, has, I would suggest, a strong similarity, we might say uncanny, again, similarity, to our own processes of aging and death. Maybe something more that leads to this. Oh, I'm so sorry. We have a remarkable capacity to suppress this fear. Every year, the Chapman University in California asks Americans to rate their fear level on a scale for a wide range of issues. As we would expect, it's a box ticking all of those salient issues that concern people. Terrorist attacks, pandemics, nuclear attack, all come top. Climate change, as you can imagine, way down the list of things which cause people fear. But even further down the list is people's fear of their own death. Only 20% report that they are frightened of dying. That's somewhere in between people's fear of needles and people's fear of artificial intelligence. And as I now come into my 50s, I'm increasingly keen to deny the warning signs of my own aging. I find myself looking only in certain mirrors from certain angles under certain controlled light conditions, like Greta Garbo. I think maybe even that joke shows my age. Only I have to say, only with great reluctance after years of itching and scratching my nose that I finally bite the bullet and buy a battery-powered nasal hair trimmer, which I feel is one of the clear symptoms of aging. Is it any surprise then, given our own capacity to ignore the evidence of steadily progressing decay and the finiteness of our own lives, that we're so skilled at ignoring the evidence of a steady collapse of stable climate patterns? And is it maybe any surprise that the demographic group most inclined to deny climate science is the one that I belong to? White, educated, middle-aged men. And as extensive research in terror management theory shows, when people are reminded of their own mortality, even obliquely or subliminally in experiments, they tend to become far more defensive of their own values and conservative in their attitudes. Is it any surprise, indeed, that people respond to climate change with its uncanny mortality salience, with an intense and angry defense of their own values? Which brings me on to the focus group work, which I have been doing for much of the last year, listening to grassroots conservatives. I love listening to people. It's part of a joy of my work, even though you're probably getting a sense of me as somebody who just won't shut up. I actually, in my work, spend quite a lot of time sitting and listening to people. My environmental colleagues who express concern about the lack of diversity in our own movement really mean diversity of the kind of people they like. They seem to have spent very little time actually talking to ordinary people with conservative values. But as I sit in these groups, and I listen to the same cliched denial tropes of how climate change was the invention of self-interested academics seeking university grants. I'm sure you'd all agree with that. Environmental extremists or that action is pointless because China apparently is building a coal-fired power station every 4 days, or that climate change anyway, if there even was such a thing, had stopped or it had retreated, or it's caused by volcanoes, or in any case Antarctica was growing. My overwhelming feeling was actually one of intense anger, not towards them, who are decent, honourable people trying to make sense of this the same way that we all do, but actually to the professional deniers, and especially the compliant and self-serving cynics in the media who allow them a soapbox and indeed have reneged on their professional responsibility to inform without prejudice. Because these stories which are held out there do not appear from nowhere. They have been deliberately planted, and decent, intelligent, thoughtful people, confused and bewildered by the range of messages they receive, have fallen by default on the ones that are most appealing and speak most strongly to their conservative values. The absence of a clear and distinctive conservative narrative on climate change, in my view, has been a disaster for public policy, for government mobilization, and for general public engagement. As a disaster, it is a disaster because dangerous mistakes come when we fail to recognize that people's values can lead them to define the world in different ways. My own area in Mid Wales, for example, the most inspiring community campaign I've ever seen, defending the environment against the depredations of global corporations, has been the campaign against wind farms. Wind farms were sold to the people of Mid Wales by the Welsh Government as an important step in our contribution towards climate change, doing our bit. That was because the people who were proposing it were environmentalists, and their attitudes were geared towards the global ecology and global justice. The problem came that the people in my own community are also passionate environmentalists, but their definition of environment concerns the local environment, in particular the landscape, to which they are extremely attached. And so you had a conflict between environmentalists and environmentalists, both fighting passionately about the thing that they care about, because the two sides simply did not understand or speak to the values of the other. Well, and all I can say to conservatives is just be glad that you don't have, maybe yet, a far-left Jeremy Corbyn government, because the next thing you know, he'll be blowing billions of pounds of taxpayer money subsidising uneconomic centralised nuclear power projects, no doubt handing over British sovereignty to his buddies in a communist dictatorship. Yes, as you can see, certain things in conservative energy policy have completely detached all connection with normal conservative values. So, such then is the cognitive landscape of climate change. We know it's happening, but it struggles to find the necessary qualities to demand our attention. It's a shape-shifting, jelly mold issue that exists for us in this culturally constructed format. We understand the data, but somehow we can keep that separate from action. It doesn't compel us to action. What do we read? What we need are storylines, compelling storylines and a socially constructed narrative that move us to action. Given that people are primarily motivated by these narratives, surely the first step has to be to find the language which actually really speaks to their values. For the past 10 years, my charity, Climate Outreach, has been developing and testing, especially testing, which is critically important. It's not just coming up with some idea, it's finding if it works, climate change language for different audiences. On the basis of this work, we found that young people crave authenticity in their communicators, but find it very hard to overcome the perception that climate change might be uncool. Trades unionists are curiously repelled by all talk about lifestyles. I mean, talk about disgust, like backing away off from it, but nonetheless become very energized around language around solidarity. Lifestyles about you can do your bit. As an individual, trades unions become excited by the idea that collectively, through our collective action, we can make change. But people have a pride in their national identity that can cross boundaries, that can cross the boundaries of class and politics. And there's plenty of room there for doing communication around national values. Health is a far stronger motivator of people than ecology. All people of faith, and we've done research with all of the world's main 5 faiths, They share a view, which is interesting across all of the faiths, that the world is a precious gift. And in this sense, a gift is a frame within which they can understand climate change that has to be cherished. Conservatives, interestingly, are surprisingly cynical of big business, despite the fact that my friends in the environment movement think the best way to speak to them is to say, hey, all these big businesses support it. But grassroots conservatives are very cynical of that and just say, well, they're just doing it for the money, aren't they? And people of all ages, of all politics, just yearn for strong, honest, authentic leadership. I think in particular, though, it's vital that we start to talk about it. To take heed of climate change, people need a social signal that it's something that they need to take attention of. And at the moment, by keeping silent, the only signal that they are putting out is an endorsement of yet further silence. So the most inspiring and dramatic social changes of my lifetime have been in areas where people have decided to challenge collective silence. Gay rights, disabled rights, gender inequality, racism, sexual abuse are all areas where people have been prepared to hold their views publicly and, if necessary, to challenge their friends and family when they think that they break with them. I urge you to take this to heart. Doggedly, quietly, without lecturing, hold your commitment and share it with the people around you. In my own life, I seek to have a conversation every day with a stranger about climate change. It's not always possible. I mean, most of the time I live in a small community in mid-Wales with a small community of about 2,500 people, so it's a bit hard to have a conversation with somebody new every day. It's already reached a point where people cross the road to get to the other side and they see me going around the corner. But when I'm away, I try to, like the poor woman in the Hawthorne Hotel as I was writing my speech this afternoon, who said, oh, that looks interesting, what is it? And then regretted asking me. Don't force it. Don't push it. Just drop it into conversations. Most of the time, people are going to change the conversation. They're not going to want to keep talking. But some are going to feel a relief to finally talk to somebody about it. 1/3 of people cannot recall ever having had a conversation in their entire lives with anybody about climate change, and you could very well be that first conversation. In particular, I think we have to find better ways to speak to the vast bulk of the population that have moderate centre-right values. Many of them are already concerned, but they think that they're in a small minority because, of course, they're misreading the social cues of the people around them. And actually, given that, I think it's an act of considerable bravery and independence that they still maintain their concern even when they think that most people like them don't share it. So if any of you in this audience are in this group, especially if you are in that most skeptical demographic, older, affluent, white, conservative men, then please, it is especially important that you make your concern known to the people around you. Never mind insulating your loft or unplugging your nasal hair trimmer when it's fully recharged. Generating a social proof is, without question, the most effective thing that you can do around you. But we need more. We need far more. We need to find new and inspiring ways to think about ourselves and each other on the journey we're on. We don't think or dream in facts, figures or graphs or spreadsheets. I don't think anymore we dream in poems, actually, or couplets or iambic pentameter. I think we dream in movies. We dream in film. The film critic David Thompson said, quote, "The influence of movies is not just a cultural sidebar, like an evening a week set aside for our fun. It's the engine of our time, a model for how we look and decide, participate or spectate." So we need a mythic, filmic narrative. Engaging with climate change will depend on this, of challenge, of struggle, of triumph, in which we can all place ourselves as participants and heroes. And if we don't, I guarantee that another mythic enemy narrative will take over of attack or defense or nihilism or despair. I'm convinced that these compelling narratives need to be based on completeness, of the values and humanity that we share, of finding a unifying purpose. This is also a model of change. In my experience, no major change has happened without a very wide range of participants, of perspectives, of politics, of tactics. Deep social change never comes from any one place. We need the radicals, and we need the protesters, and we need the visionaries, but we need the theorists, we need the people inside the polity, we need the people on the left, we need the people on the right, we need the people who engineer the solutions. My friends and colleagues on the left, and let's face it, that's a very large part of the environmental movement, maintain, I feel in their hearts, a model of kind of vanguard model that they alone can sweep away social injustice. And false consciousness, which is how I think they regard climate change now. And frankly, they're wrong. Regardless of one's politics, I think it is utter folly to think that this is an issue that can be overcome without broad-based commitment to action that crosses political boundaries. And that's why we need to recognize that the greatest wisdom is probably the wisdom of crowds, which brings me back to a point of diversity. To my mind, the greatest argument for diversity, whether it's ethnic or gender equality, is not social justice, although I personally am very strongly committed to that and think it is very important, but that it's because we all benefit from the shared learning that comes from different approaches, from being around people who are not like ourselves. And when it comes to climate change, diversity is key. We all need to learn and gain from each other because all of us carries a part of the wisdom of the solution. It doesn't mean we have to like each other. Doesn't mean that we have to agree. We may very well have huge arguments down the line about means and solutions in the world we want to see coming from it. In the last World War, there was unity behind a common purpose of fighting the war, but this did not mean that people agreed on the reasons that they were fighting it. There were very different visions, especially between the left and right, about the world people wished to see. Conservatives wanted to defend the social order and the empire. Socialists wanted equality and the transformation of power, but they could all work together around the common vision of working together. Let's just try something out. Let's start looking at your hands. Our hands. Let's look at your hands. Our hands have a... Thank you, just go with me for a moment. It's too late to get out. Our hands are the greatest tool of our shared humanity. It's the tool that's built so much through cooperation. So our hands also, as tool makers, our great gift as a species which led us into this crisis. It's our hands that will pull us through. It's our hands which will construct through cooperation the world in which we're going to create. Now, hold them in front of you. Look at your hands. Now reach out and hold the person next to you. Okay, I know you're British, but give it a go. You don't have to if you feel embarrassed doing this. Try and do it. There's method in this madness. Just hold them, and oh, that's so nice across that. I love that. So you've seen the divide. The divide, it's like the two parts of our brain, and you're reaching across the gulf. I love that. As you do that, just feel that. Connect and reconnect with the common humanity that you feel through that hand. The common humanity of everyone in this room, of love and loss, of life, death, childhood, aging, grief and hope, that everybody feels, the things we all have in common. And now imagine the power if we carry that energy out into the world, the energy that you can feel just simply from holding someone's hand and apply it to this wicked but this all too solvable problem. And that is what you feel if you connect with other people, is ultimately the spirit that will help us to overcome this crisis. Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome. Yeah. You're welcome to keep holding hands, by the way. You might make some new friends. Rich is going to take some questions. Oh, yes. I would like, do we have a moment for a minute? Rich, thank you. I would like, in that spirit of togetherness, so that it's not just me talking at you the whole time, just with the person next to you, ideally somebody who you didn't come with, just to talk for just a couple of minutes about any thoughts or ideas you've had from what I'm saying, and hopefully things that you disagree with, before we go into the questions. Just for a couple of minutes, just talk to the person next to you about what you've been hearing.
Right. All right. Well, so hopefully that was all interesting.
They don't want to stop.
Oh, they don't want to stop. They certainly don't want to stop. You just have to sort of wrap up your final thoughts there. Right, so we're now going to open up, I think we have about 10 minutes for questions, for a bit of question and answer with George. Okay, so a few of you have some questions.
I also want to say, by the way, I'm very happy to have things I don't have to answer. If there are people here and you just have a point you want to make, I'm very happy to have that. It doesn't have to be in this sort of, tutorial format of asking me a question when I answer it. If it's just something you want to say.
All right, we'll start here.
During the beginning of your speech, near the middle really, you sort of mumbled something. I wanted to pick up on it. You said,
It's probably because I lost my way in my script.
you said that you didn't like calling climate change the greatest threat to human history.
Yeah.
You may not. So I just wondered why you said that.
I have to confess it's because somehow, I think I said I don't mind calling it that, but it's true, it was an apologetic tone. I think it's because in a funny way I feel embarrassed when I call it what it is. I think we probably all do, but it's I don't know, because there's always a fear, even with an accepting audience like this, that if you name this thing for what it is, you sound, a little bit extreme or nuts. It's the problem. I guess the thing I've been trying to say for you is that I too am struggling to make sense of this thing and to express it for what it is. And the fear that I won't be taken seriously if I do. No.
You talked earlier about we sort of accepting of gay rights and equalities, and we have those conversations. Yeah. But I find that that's easy to have a conversation about because I'm not a hypocrite when it comes to gay rights, and I don't have to give up anything for somebody to be gay or have a gay marriage. And if I start having a conversation with people about climate change on any level, the first thing they do is say, well, you drive a car, or you do this, or you do that. And I think one of the biggest issues we struggle with is saying to people that people think as soon as you have a climate change conversation, A, you're attacking them, which you might be a bit, and B, you're asking them to give something up. And I think that's what makes it a much harder conversation, and why people then start talking about spinach tarts instead.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're right. And I think the only thing that one can do in this situation is basically to model that internal conflict for other people. I'm a great believer in communicating, and you've seen me do it myself, of modeling for people what is happening inside yourself in order to make it possible for them. I think people hate the idea of being judged, but if you were to say, well, yes, I struggle with this. Because it does go to this essence of what I'm saying about the kind of the inherent problem with climate change, but we are all in various ways involved with it. We create distance because normally we can engage with issues that already have distance. You can feel very bad about issues that are far away that you know that you're not directly involved and implicated in. I guess the thing to do is just to present people with that as being the challenge. And I think the other thing to do is also to actively avoid judging people for their own behaviors, but just to model on the basis of your own. I think it is one of the reasons why it is very important for us to be consistent in our own behavior between our belief in climate change and our own emissions. In my own life I struggle with this. I like meat and I try not to eat it. I love flying and I try not to do it, and I share that with people. But it would be extremely inconsistent to behave however you like, and then, and if you can talk to people about that. But I think always presenting it as a conflict is necessary. But thank you. Yes, I think that is the problem with that.
So we've got a question over here.
Yeah. Hello.
Hello. I was standing outside handing out leaflets for the climate march in Bristol on the 29th. And George very kindly took a flyer, although he's not actually going to be in Bristol. You said you were going to be marching in Paris.
Yeah, I'm going to be burning cars in Paris.
So
true French tradition.
I wanted to know, because several other people I tried to hand out flyers to as they walked in, and although I'm sure are aware that climate change is a really big issue that we should be concerned about, maybe don't think that marching is worth doing. So I wanted to ask you, why will you be marching, and why do you think it's a good thing to do?
Thank you. So yes, please, everybody, do consider supporting that. So there are several reasons for that. Firstly, because I believe passionately that people on the streets is an important aspect of social change. And my desire of that is to diversify that. I'd like to see more people doing that. I think it's also a form of creating the social proof that I've been talking about. But I'd like to say especially, I think that the greatest role of marches is not as a political instrument. I think, in fact, the governments and media don't pay much attention to marches, which distresses me. I mean, I was actually in New York because I was on a book tour on the huge march in New York for 400,000 people in New York, and it didn't make any of the national news networks, which is a shocking form of collective, I think in some ways politically motivated silence. But it utterly transformed the people on it. So the reason I go on is I need to be reinvigorated with that sense of the fact that I'm not just alone, but I'm part of a group. But also I'd urge you, this is a great opportunity to get somebody else involved and ask them just to do this one thing. Because I think going on a march is a great entry point for people. I think it can be personally transformative. And I didn't say it when I was talking, but when I was writing the book, some of the strongest ideas I had, the most inspiring ones, came from evangelicals, who normally no one working on environmental issues would talk with them. But I was very interested because they have a very deep understanding of how to mobilize people around things which are difficult and challenging. They have a concept in evangelism which is actually taking people to a point of personal choice because they recognize the role of epiphany in changing people. And I think going on a march is a bit like that. I think for many people, I think it's a point where people stand up to be counted. So that's why I'd recommend not just going yourself, but trying to get somebody else to go. And please do go. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for your.
Where are we?
Thank you for your illuminating talk. I also was a student here at Bristol University nearly 40 years ago. And at that time, we knew about climate change. We knew that it was coming. You talk about the need for mythic, filmic narratives, for compelling storylines. Are you aware that this university is still investing in fossil fuels? Are you aware that I wonder whether this is part of the blind spot that this university has? But if we are looking for those compelling storylines, then surely the first thing for us to do is to put our own house in order. There is a student group, Fossil Free Bristol University, and they need all of the support of all of the people in this room, because if we're going to make any impact, it has to start at home. Would you agree with this?
Thank you. I would agree with that. I don't want to be rude to my hosts in the university, but I'm very happy that you raised the point. I would agree that there is a collective blind spot when it comes to investment in fossil fuel industry, and I personally think that it's not even a matter of divestment. I think actually we have to stop funding digging the stuff out of the ground. It is very clear. There's currently $1 trillion a year in capital expenditure which goes into expanding the frontier of fossil fuels, of finding ever more of this stuff when we know we can't even burn what is already there. And thank you, it is a blind spot. I should also add, the most extraordinary blind spot of all is not just within people's investment decisions, but within the international process. When I was writing the book, I interviewed a large number of people who had attended every single session of the United Framework Convention on Climate Change, Sir John Horton, who is the founder of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, John Ashton, who is the lead British lead of a British delegation to the climate conferences, not a single person could identify a single time ever in the negotiations when anyone had talked about fossil fuel production. So you have a process that is obsessed with emissions, of stopping these gases once the stuff is burnt, and seems incapable to deal in any way with the stuff being pulled out of the ground. And obviously there's political reasons for that. But I welcome the divestment campaign, but I'd like it to go further. I'd like to see an international moratorium on all investment in new fossil fuel production, ultimately a cap on production. I would say in the area, sorry, I'm going slightly off pitch here, but in the area of international policy, it is unthinkable to have a drugs policy which only looks at the drugs which are sold on the street and doesn't look at the poppy fields or the cocoa production that fuels it. And it's similarly no different for fossil fuels. It's ridiculous to not have a policy on production, but to have a policy on emissions. And that is, in my view, and I argue in the book, I won't explain this all now, a cognitive mistake which has been made because of false narratives and metaphors. So, yeah, no, I'm very happy to. I do other things, but yeah. No, totally. No, I'm happy to. You're welcome.
I think we have 2 more questions. You've had your hand up for a while. Oh, no. And you in the back row as well, as the next one. And maybe if they're quick, we might be able to squeeze in a third.
Okay, and I'll try and be very quick in my answers, please.
All right, very briefly, because my question follows on from that gentleman's. I'm an alumni representative on the court of the university and a sponsor of a motion to the next court for the university to commit to divesting from fossil fuels. The court, as some people in this room will know, it would be fair to say it's dominated by older middle-class, white, conservative males. So what is the narrative that my colleagues and I should try and construct for them?
I think the most important thing to do is to find other people who are in a similar position to themselves in the university which have made the decision and to start the conversation between them. In other words, the starting point I'd be looking for there would be to go to universities that already had divested and actually see if you can arrange a conversation between people at the most senior possible level of the university and mobilize those peer communicators, because then they can talk the same language and the same style. You know, because already there is a growing norm, we could say, like a social norm, a culture within the investment community and within, for example, like large institutional investors like universities, that you need to get out of this. So really where the conversation needs to happen is now between the people who have decided to make the decision and the people who are still recalcitrant. That would be my answer. Yeah.
Back there? Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you for your contribution. I want to ask for your advice on communicating. I've got a message that I've been asked to communicate about BECCS, which is bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, and actually it's a fairy tale. So I'm thinking that, you know, to communicate that as a fairy tale, but towards the end of your talk, you talked about different ways to connect with people. Yeah. And I'm wondering how I connect with people and get across the fact that this is a mythical fairy tale solution that doesn't mean we can continue to burn fossil fuels. And I particularly want to get that message across to the delegates at the COP, to academics, to scientists, to NGOs, because it refers to a report that's about to be launched on why BECCS is futile. So have you got any tips?
I'm so sorry. Carbon capture and storage I know about, but this is something slightly different.
Bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. So Drax Power Station in Yorkshire had the White Rose project. It's been ditched. It cost too much. But it's still mentioned in the IPCC report over 100 times.
Yes, I don't know quite how to do this, but I'm also deeply concerned that I don't know about the bioenergy aspect, that carbon capture and storage exists as a missing part for a narrative. I think you're right. I have mixed views. I think that there is a technological possibility for doing it, but the primary reason why, for example, oil companies are deeply committed to the narrative of carbon capture and storage is because it provides the justification for continuing doing it. Indeed, the coal industry. So this is something which is within the realm of what I work on, that people will, that you look, for example, at the Shell produces these annual future scenarios. And they have this, I'm working from memory now, but as I recall, they have this vision that by 2050, 80% of the world's electricity production will be carbon capture and storage. This is fantasy. This is fantasy. This is a narrative which is required. It's the opposite of a smoking gun. It's the non-smoking gun. It's the gun that soaks up the smoke, which sits somehow in the middle of a narrative between the production and the emissions. And it's dangerous for that reason. But beyond that, how to communicate this, we'd have to have a discussion afterwards, but yeah. But thank you for raising it. I think it's worth raising the fact that this is something which is important to people for the completion of a story rather than necessarily in reality.
I'm going to squeeze one more in.
No.
Oh, there you go. You got my, there you go.
Yeah. You said that information deficit wasn't a major cause for denial. But I feel like there's a lack of education in a lot of younger people, young teens. Do you feel like it makes sense to focus more on education for younger people before we're tied down with political values and fundamental beliefs?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I mean, just because I say that information does not of itself lead to increased belief, that is not to say that a lack of information creates belief. I mean, obviously you have to know something about it before you're even in a position to make a judgment on it. And you're absolutely right. And I'm concerned by the way that climate change has slipped off. The educational agenda has slipped out of a curriculum and where it should absolutely be central to it. So I completely agree. I think that there is a fundamental need to find ways of getting the information conveyed to people. But I guess the difference is not just pedagogically, but also really in terms which manages to speak to people's concerns and values. There is certainly a problem in terms of communicating the threat of climate change to younger people, but it's a position where actually people can just back off once they realize quite how serious this is. So there has to be some careful work done in terms of how to communicate that this thing is dangerous, but not overwhelmingly dangerous. But yes, I'd completely agree. But I think that is one part of a communication strategy which also needs to include and encourage and enable peer-to-peer communication, especially between teams. Because peer-to-peer is so amazing at the moment. You know, I don't think we've quite caught on to how powerful this is, the extent to which people learn from each other through electronic networks.
That's actually what I do. I raise awareness about climate change, adapting the aesthetic of eco-friendly to appeal to that I generation, as I call them. So that's kind of what I do, really, through visuals and Instagram, social media. That's just at a point.
Well, I hope we can talk with you later.
Right, that's great. You heard the bells gong, so we really are overstaying our welcome. So we need to wrap things up.
Can I just ask one little thing? Just make one little point. Sorry.
You've got 1 point, quickly.
2 seconds. You're just talking about the narrative of the privileged white male, and I just wondered. It's not necessarily PC, but I wondered about pushing the idea of, which it does, climate change causes more migration. So could we manipulate the current narrative? Because everyone likes to talk about immigration. So that might be a way more people will be scared of climate change if they're scared of immigration. Personally, I'm not, but could we push that?
I think we have to let you respond to that.
Well, thank you, as Rich is just trying to close down, opening a huge can of worms on that one. It appears in all of the focus group work, whenever you talk and people are thinking about how to communicate with conservatives in particular, it emerges. It is, of course, a very, very dangerous narrative. It is one which needs to be actively recognized. This is part of my warning, actually, when I say to my colleagues in the environmental movement about communicating with conservatives, is I say, if you don't go out there and help to shape the way that people think about climate change, or work with them, more of a point, work with them to work collectively to shape it, it will be shaped for you. And clearly one of the ways that it could take form is in the form of feeding already into this migration fear. And that is already bubbling. I mean, thankfully, the far right does not believe in climate change. Because if they did, they'd be straight on this. So I think you're right, but it causes me great concern. Because this is exactly what I'm talking about, that in an unbalanced narrative without enemies, it will find enemies. So how better? So the answer to that is, okay, I think we better continue the discussion later on. But I think that is something which personally causes me great concern, and I think is I think that there are many better ways of speaking, especially to conservative values, than migration. I think it's one to be avoided. Yeah.
That's fantastic. There will be a chance, as George is signing some books outside, to continue on the conversation, obviously on a more one-to-one scale. I wanted to leave as much time for questions as possible, but obviously being the 5th anniversary of the Cabot Institute, we do have to thank a few people, and I'm going to rattle through this as quickly as possible since I promised not to prattle on this evening. So first of all, I did want to thank the Festival of Ideas, who we put on a lot of these events with, throughout all of the years and over the past 5 years. Nishan already mentioned this, but we really have to thank the leadership of the university for having faith in us and supporting us through all of the wild and rather interesting ideas and adventures that we've had over the years. It's been very, very exciting, but we've had a huge amount of support from the university. I have to thank my Cabot team. They're not all here, but there's Amanda and Philippa and other Amanda and Mike and Caroline and where's Haley? I'm trying to see all of you. There's Haley, right? So there you all are, and you've met all of them. They're brilliant, and also. And I couldn't have done this job without them. They're absolutely amazing, and I should embarrass them more, but I don't have time to do so. I wanted to thank all of our boards and theme leaders. There's a lot of members of the boards here who have supported us, our deans, our external boards, our theme leaders are all around the audience. Brilliant people who have basically supported us, challenged us, and been quite provocative colleagues and collaborators over the past few months. And then finally, most importantly, I wanted to thank all of you. And you is a rather mixed audience, and that is exactly what Cabot is. I wanted to thank all of the academics. There's loads of academic friends who I've met over the past 5 years who are in this room. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of the partners throughout the city. We have members of the Bristol Youth Council, Bristol City Council, SUSTRANS, all sorts of organizations here that we've worked with, and they're amazing. And all of you who we've worked with have been amazing. And most importantly, thank you to all of you who are just generally interested in this, passionate about it, leading climate marches, asking provocative questions about university policy, challenging us, and really, really making this a very, very exciting area to work in. We're looking forward to the next 5 years. I would like to finish by once again thanking George. It has been an absolute pleasure. About 6 months ago, those of us in the Cabot team who were avid readers of your books and really, really appreciated everything that you were doing, then we found out you were one of the alumni of the university. And we found that out. There we go. Heck yes, we are going to get him to be our annual lecturer. That's amazing because we have appreciated the work you've been doing on widening the conversation for years, and thank you so much for a fantastic annual lecture. Cheers.